Can you believe that an entire civilization, the greatest empire the world had ever seen, the very definition of order and law, could simply vanish? One day there were legions, aqueducts, and libraries. The next, there was only silence, punctuated by the agonizing screams of a world tearing itself apart. This is not just a history lesson you fall asleep to. This is the true, blood-soaked story of how the lights went out across Europe and how the nightmare known as medieval France was clawed into existence from the pit of that darkness. The catastrophe no one saw coming wasn't a single decisive battle, but a slow, agonizing death of infrastructure, knowledge, and hope, beginning the moment Rome's iron grip slipped from the north. Imagine a time when the roads, built by emperors to last 1,000 years, became choked with weeds, the milestones shattered by desperate bandits, and the marble villas crumbled under the weight of sheer neglect. The complex systems that fed millions, the grain shipments from Africa, the trade routes that crisscrossed the Mediterranean, all collapsed into dust, leaving only famine and the chilling sound of the unseen enemy, plague. The year is 476 AD, and while a distant emperor might have technically been deposed, the real disaster was local and absolute. Cities like Lutetia, the future Paris, once vibrant hubs of Roman administration and culture, were suddenly islands in a sea of chaos, their populations dwindling by terrifying amounts. When the legions finally left, they didn't just take the soldiers, they took the administrators, the tax collectors, the engineers, and worst of all, they took the idea of civilization itself. What followed was the terrifying abyss known as the Dark Ages, a 500-year struggle for survival, where the very concept of a central government evaporated like dew under a brutal summer sun. Literacy vanished so rapidly that ancient texts were used as kindling. Coinage disappeared, forcing communities back into a terrifying barter system where strength, not law, dictated value. This was the moment the ancient world yielded to the primal, and across the devastated landscape of Gaul, new, terrifying powers began to stir. These were not refined, educated men in togas. These were the Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, the Burgundians, and most terrifyingly for our story, the Franks. They were squat, hairy, and utterly brutal warriors who cared nothing for Roman law, valuing only loyalty to their chieftain and the gleam of captured gold. They didn't arrive to integrate, they arrived to conquer and consume, setting the stage for 1,000 years of brutal, necessary violence. And right in the middle of this boiling crucible of collapse and conquest, one line of men, the Merovingians, managed to achieve the unthinkable. They began to build something new upon the rod of the old empire. But the price of this foundation was unimaginable treachery, ritualistic murder, and a constant river of blood that stained the annals of early France forever. We are talking about warlords who would marry multiple women to secure alliances one week, only to murder their nephews the next to eliminate rivals for power. Their story begins not with a king, but with a shadowy figure known only as Merovech, a near-mythical chieftain whose very name suggested magic and violence, rumored to be born from a sea monster. Legend or not, his descendants became the first dynasts to truly seize control of the fragmented region. But the man who turned this tribal savagery into the beginnings of a kingdom, the man whose ambition was so immense it reshaped the map of Europe, was Clovis. Imagine Clovis, a chieftain ruling a small section of the Salian Franks, a man defined by his cunning and his utter lack of mercy. By his early 20s, he knew that the only way to survive the Dark Ages was not to adapt to the chaos, but to master it. His goal was simple: destroy every rival tribe, subdue every Roman remnant, and unite the fractured lands of Gaul under a single iron fist. And he was prepared to commit any atrocity necessary to achieve it. Remember the famous tale of the Soissons vase? A magnificent liturgical vessel, looted by the Frankish warriors. When Clovis demanded it be returned to the bishop, a shrewd political move to court the powerful Christian establishment, one soldier, a common Frankish warrior who understood only the law of loot, dared to defy his chieftain. The warrior raised his battle axe and smashed the vase, declaring that Clovis only got what the lot dictated. This wasn't just revenge. It was a defining declaration. The old tribal system of shared loot and limited authority was dead. From this moment on, the Frankish people had a king, and his word was absolute law, backed by terrifying, premeditated violence. This act cemented Clovis's power, not just through fear, but through the realization that he was a man who planned his brutality, making him far more dangerous than any impulsive barbarian. But Clovis understood that sheer terror wasn't enough to build an enduring kingdom. He needed the one thing that still held moral authority and structure in the ruined landscape: the church. The remaining Roman population, though battered, was Christian, and the bishops held the keys to administration, literacy, and legitimacy. His conversion, therefore, was perhaps the greatest political move in early French history, an earthquake that changed the spiritual and political map forever. The legend, magnified by centuries of court historians, claims that during a desperate battle against the Alemanni, Clovis swore that if the Christian god of his wife Clotilde granted him victory, he would convert. The Alemanni routed. Whether it was genuine faith or brilliant strategy, the result was the same. Christmas Day, 496 AD, Clovis was baptized alongside 3,000 of his most loyal warriors. This monumental event did more than just change his personal religion. It transformed the Franks into the only major Germanic tribe to be Orthodox Catholic, gaining them the immediate, zealous support of the papacy and the entire Gallo-Roman population. Now, Clovis wasn't just a brutal warlord. He was God's chosen instrument, tasked with purging heresy and darkness from Gaul. With this divine justification, his wars of conquest became sacred crusades, and the stage was violently set for the creation of the kingdom that would one day be called France. But the terror had only just begun. The age of the do-nothing kings and the rise of the true power behind the throne, the mayors of the palace, was waiting just around the corner, promising betrayals so deep they would make Clovis look like a novice. We left the Frankish realm teetering on a razor's edge, ruled not by kings, but by ghosts. These were the Roi Feignants, the do-nothing kings, the ultimate historical punchline that proved civilization could wither even while a royal line survived. The mighty bloodline of Clovis, the dynasty that tore Gaul from Roman ruin, had curdled into a series of long-haired mystic puppets whose sole purpose was to exist, not to rule. Imagine a king so utterly useless. His only job was to occasionally appear in public, sitting on an ox cart, long, greasy hair flowing, a sacred yet empty symbol of a vanished era. They had the divine mandate, yes, but the actual administrative burden, the grueling, thankless work of keeping a collapsing society from total oblivion, fell to another office entirely. This was the mayor of the palace, the major domus. Initially, they were just the chief stewards of the royal household, managing the estate and the royal servants. But slowly, meticulously, like a creeping vine strangling a great oak, they clawed away every shred of sovereignty from the ornamental king. They controlled the treasury, they commanded the armies, they signed the treaties that mattered. The Merovingian king was the mascot. The mayor was the monster running the entire machine, hiding in the shadows of the throne. For generations, this shadow government played the longest, deadliest game in medieval politics, culminating in one family seizing absolute, undeniable control: the Pepinids. Enter Pepin II, Pepin of Herstal, a man whose ambition was as vast as the wilderness he sought to tame. He wasn't satisfied with merely running one fragment of the Frankish kingdom. He wanted to reunite the warring factions of Austrasia, Neustria, and Burgundy under one single powerful fist. The moment of truth arrived in 687 AD at the Battle of Tertry. This wasn't just a skirmish over borders, it was a hostile corporate takeover of the entire Frankish future. It pitted Pepin II, the ruthless strongman of Austrasia, the more Germanic eastern half, against the establishment of Neustria, the western Romanized heartland. When Pepin crushed the Neustrian forces, the reverberations were felt across Europe. He had effectively crowned himself the undisputed master of all the Franks, establishing a dynasty's true power more than 150 years before they officially dared to wear the crown itself. He consolidated power, stabilized the borders, and ruled for nearly 3 decades of brutal efficiency. But the moment Pepin II died in 714 AD, the entire, fragile system detonated. Succession was a messy, bloody business in the Dark Ages, and the legitimate heirs Pepin left behind were weak and easily manipulated. The court immediately fractured into warring camps, smelling blood, and the chance to reclaim the power Pepin had so violently centralized. Plectrude thought she had neutralized the greatest threat to her power, locking him away, believing the problem was solved through brute force and legal maneuvering. She was wrong, dead wrong. In the ensuing chaos and civil war, Charles burst free from his captivity, like a historical earthquake shaking the very foundations of the palace walls. His escape wasn't subtle. It was a declaration of war against every pretender, every weakling, and every rival who stood in his path to ultimate authority. Charles was a force of nature, ruthless, brilliant, and completely unstoppable on the battlefield. He wasn't just a politician. He was a revolutionary general, forging loyalty through unending victory and sheer terror. He brought the independent duchies to heel, forced the Saxons and Bavarians back across the borders, and restored a semblance of terrifying order to the fragmented map of Francia. But just as Charles was finally consolidating his brutal reign, the horizon darkened with a terror from the south that made local Frankish wars look like child's play. The Umayyad Caliphate, having conquered the entirety of Visigothic Spain, had crossed the Pyrenees Mountains and were now probing deep into the soft underbelly of Gaul itself. These were not small raiding parties looking for loot. These were massive, professional armies of cavalry, disciplined and driven by an unstoppable religious fervor. They had shattered every kingdom in their path, from Gibraltar to the Ebro, and now they were eyeing the rich treasuries and fertile fields of the Frankish lands as the next logical stepping stone toward the heart of Europe. The fate of Christian Europe suddenly depended entirely on one man, an illegitimate, escaped prisoner who wasn't even technically a king, but who carried a name that would define an era: Charles, soon to be known as Martel, the hammer. The year is 732 AD, and the immense armies of Islam are marching on the sacred city of Tours, carrying the weight of destiny on their saddles. Charles Martel stood ready, knowing that if he failed, the story of France, and indeed Western civilization, would end right there, swallowed whole by the crescent moon and the unstoppable tide of conquest. This was the high-stakes gamble for the soul of the continent, a confrontation between two titans where only one could survive the blinding flash of the future, and Charles was about to prove why he earned the title of the Hammer. The moment the Umayyad cavalry, the unstoppable force that had shattered empires from the Levant to Iberia, saw Charles Martel arrayed against them, they must have felt a shiver. A sensation utterly alien to their decades of unbroken victory. They were accustomed to rich cities and cowardly lords. They were not accustomed to the brutal, iron-willed cohesion of the northern tribes, hardened by centuries of freezing rain and endless conflict. The year was 732 AD. And the fate of Europe hung by a thread thinner than a spider's silk, stretched across the plain between Poitiers and Tours. For nearly a century, the great wave of Islamic conquest had rolled forward, consuming everything in its path, and now, led by the brilliant governor of Al-Andalus, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, that wave was set to crash over the final ramparts of Gaul. Martel, however, was not fighting a traditional battle. He was fighting a test of endurance, a grinding, merciless attrition that favored the shield wall, not the swift, devastating charge. He chose his ground perfectly, high, forested land that neutralized the overwhelming advantage of the Umayyad heavy cavalry, forcing them to fight uphill into the teeth of the Frankish defense. Imagine the sheer, deafening terror of that charge. Thousands upon thousands of horsemen, renowned across the known world for their speed and ferocity, slamming into a static, unflinching Frankish line. It was not a battle of maneuver. It was a hammer striking an anvil over and over until one side fractured. The chroniclers speak of the Franks standing like a wall of ice, unmoved by the fiery torrent of the invaders. All day long, the Frankish infantry, surprisingly well-disciplined for the era, held their ground, their heavy axes and spears doing devastating work against the lighter armor of the Moorish horsemen. They knew that retreat meant annihilation, not just for them, but for their entire world. Then came the tactical masterstroke, the move that earned Charles his legendary name. As the main force of the Umayyads focused on breaking the center, Martel ordered a small, highly mobile contingent to circle around and threaten the Umayyad supply train and, critically, their camp. Panic erupted in the Umayyad rear. Reports flashed through the ranks that the Frankish devils were looting the treasures they had fought so hard to secure, and that their women and families, traveling with the army, were now exposed. Discipline vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by the primal urge to protect family and hoard. Abd al-Rahman, realizing his army was dissolving into chaos, desperately tried to rally his men. He was everywhere, shouting orders, attempting to re-establish the line, but in the confusion of the retreat and the sudden shift of focus, destiny intervened with blinding speed. A Frankish spear, perhaps by luck, perhaps guided by the hand of a furious god, found its mark. Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi fell dead on the battlefield. The news shot through the Umayyad ranks like a poisoned arrow. Their leader was gone, their treasure was vulnerable, and the cold, unyielding wall of the Franks still stood. The following morning, when Charles Martel prepared his men for the final gruesome day of combat, silence greeted them. The Umayyad army, utterly demoralized and leaderless, had vanished under the cover of darkness, retreating south in a desperate attempt to return to Iberia. Europe was safe. He crushed the Aquitanians, finally bringing the unruly south under centralized control, and systematically campaigned in Frisia and Saxony, pushing the boundaries of the Frankish domain to the east, compelling pagan tribes into submission through the brutal gospel of the sword. Martel was the king in all but name, the Maior Domus, the mayor of the palace, exercising total control while the pathetic remnants of the Merovingian bloodline, the Rois Fainéants, the do-nothing kings, sat in gilded cages, their long hair and ancient rituals mocked by the new reality of military might. His power was absolute, yet Charles, with a shrewdness that defined his lineage, never claimed the crown for himself. He understood that the time was not quite ripe, that the spiritual legitimacy of the old line, however weak, still held sway among the superstitious masses. He was building a stage, setting the props, ensuring that when the moment came, his son would step forward not just as a powerful general, but as the rightful heir to a newly forged empire. The hammer was paving the way for the ultimate ascension, preparing the greatest power shift Western Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. He understood the necessity of the Church, forging crucial alliances with the papacy, seeing the spiritual power of Rome as the ultimate tool for unifying his diverse, often pagan subjects. This wasn't merely politics. It was a vision of a unified Christian Gaul under Frankish command. When Charles Martel finally breathed his last in 741, he divided his massive domain, like the Frankish kings before him, among his two surviving sons, Carloman and Pepin. This was a potentially catastrophic step backward, threatening to undo the centralization he had fought so hard to achieve. Carloman, however, was a man of piety, perhaps burdened by the immense violence required to secure his family's rule. He stunned the Frankish world in 747, abruptly renouncing his share of power and retiring to a monastery in Italy, abandoning the brutal game of thrones for the quiet life of prayer. This left Pepin, Charles's youngest son, in sole, undisputed control of the entire Frankish kingdom. The board was cleared, the pieces were set. Pepin III, known to history as Pepin the Short, not for lack of ambition, but perhaps for his stature, now stood ready to seize the ultimate prize. He had the military might of the entire Frankish domain behind him, the loyalty of the aristocracy cemented by years of shared victory, and the unwavering support of the Church, an alliance his father had meticulously cultivated. The last pathetic Merovingian king, Childeric III, was nothing more than a political ghost, a relic of a bygone age. The time for pretense was over. Pepin the Short looked south to Rome, where Pope Zachary held the key to the most audacious move in medieval history, the legal, divinely sanctioned overthrow of a 1,000-year-old dynasty. The ultimate game was about to begin, and Pepin was ready to swap the title of mayor for the glittering, lethal weight of the crown. The year is 751 AD, and the air around the Frankish court was thick with the scent of treachery, not the petty, backstabbing kind, but the world-changing, dynastic annihilation kind. Pepin, the man who had done all the kingly work without the crown, finally had the one piece of leverage he truly needed, the solemn, holy endorsement of the Pope himself. Pope Zachary had essentially signed the death warrant for the Merovingian bloodline, confirming that the man who held the power should rightfully hold the title of king. This was not just a political shift, this was the brutal, glorious birth of an entirely new, terrifying relationship between church and state that would define the next 1,000 years of European destiny. The last true king of the Franks, the final sad echo of Clovis's greatness, was named Childeric III. He was, by all accounts, a shadow, a puppet with fraying strings, residing in a gilded cage while Pepin ran the entire empire. And now, even the cage was being snatched away, in a move of such cold, calculated cruelty that it still sends chills down the spine of history. Pepin did not even bother with a dramatic battle or a bloody siege to remove the last monarch. He simply sent his loyal men to the royal residence, not to kill the king, but to commit an act of ritualistic, supreme desecration. They were instructed to shave him. The deed was done. The Merovingian ghost dynasty was finally put to rest, ending over 2 centuries of rule with a whimper and the sound of clippers. In 751, Pepin the Short, son of the heroic Charles Martel, the man who saved the West, was crowned king of the Franks. But this coronation was different, history-making, and utterly magnificent in its ambition. It didn't just rely on the acclamation of the powerful Frankish nobles. It relied on oil, sacred oil, carefully poured onto his head. This radical act of anointing, performed by Bishop Boniface, a missionary of immense stature and the hammer of paganism, was the defining, irreversible moment of the coup. It declared that Pepin's rule was not merely earned by military strength or by political scheming, but was absolutely, unequivocally sanctified by God himself. This religious seal transformed Pepin from a powerful, ambitious warlord into a divinely ordained ruler, setting a terrifying precedent that would define European monarchy for the next 1,000 years. He wasn't just king, he was the Lord's anointed, and to challenge him was to challenge heaven itself. But the papacy's revolutionary endorsement was never a free gift. It was a desperate, urgent plea for sheer survival, wrapped in the glittering cloth of religious legitimacy. Italy was being brutally choked by the Lombards, a fierce, aggressive Germanic tribe pushing relentlessly toward Rome, threatening to extinguish the Papal States entirely and erase the authority of the Pope forever. Imagine the scene. The spiritual leader of Western Christendom, the successor to Peter, kneeling before the newly crowned secular power of the Franks, a tribe only recently converted. It was the ultimate, terrifying gamble for both men, but the stakes were too high to hesitate. In 754 AD, Stephen II formally re-anointed Pepin and his 2 young sons, Carloman and Charles, the one who would one day be known as Charlemagne, reinforcing the unbreakable, divine covenant through a ritual known as the Sacrament of Royalty. In return, Pepin was obligated, under the highest heavenly oath, to wage war for the defense of the Holy Church and to restore the lands that Rome had lost. Pepin delivered swiftly and brutally. Twice, the formidable Frankish army thundered across the mountains, crushing the Lombard threat with decisive force. The Franks seized the lands that the Lombards had stolen from the distant, fading Byzantine Empire, lands that included Ravenna and the surrounding fertile region of the Exarchate. But instead of returning the territory to the distant, powerless emperor in Constantinople, Pepin handed them directly to the Pope. This massive, unprecedented land grant, known forever in the annals of history as the donation of Pepin, was history-shattering in its implications. It accomplished two monumental feats simultaneously. It cemented the Carolingian dynasty's reputation as the ultimate, indispensable defenders of the Christian faith, and it formally created the Papal States, establishing the Pope not just as a spiritual leader, but as a powerful, territorial, secular ruler. The relationship between the papacy and the Frankish crown was now absolutely symbiotic, essential, and lethally effective. Pepin ruled for 16 years, transforming the Frankish kingdom from a chaotic post-Roman tribal entity into the dominant military and political force in Western Europe, all while meticulously knitting together the ultimate power of the Church and the unyielding might of the state. He was the brilliant architect of the new order, the man who dared to rewrite history using sacred oil and sheer force of will, establishing a new political legitimacy that the Merovingians could only dream of possessing. The vast kingdom was divided between the two heirs, and the quiet, unsettling tension between the brothers threatened to tear Pepin's masterpiece apart before it even truly began to flourish. Carloman was pious, perhaps too soft, and prone to internal dissent. But Charles was a storm waiting to break, a force of nature ready to be unleashed. He was a giant in every sense, both in staggering stature and in terrifying ambition, a man destined not just to rule the Franks, but to redefine what it meant to be a sovereign in Europe, ushering in an age so luminous it would later be called the Carolingian Renaissance. The stage was now perfectly set for the arrival of the man whose name would become synonymous with empire itself, the legendary figure who would cast the longest, most unforgettable shadow over all of medieval history, Charlemagne. History records them as ghosts, the last of the legendary Merovingians, known forever by the title that sealed their shame, the Roi Fainéants, the Do-Nothing Kings. They were shadows flickering in vast, ruined palaces, their long, flowing hair the ancient symbol of their sacred power, the only thing holding up the facade of rule. But everyone knew the truth. The real power, the iron fist that gripped the kingdom of Francia, did not belong to the king. It belonged to the man who stood beside the throne, the mayor of the palace. This was the most audacious political theft in the history of the Dark Ages, a bloodless revolution conducted in the perpetual shadow of the crown. Out of this dark administrative machinery rose a new lineage, and one man whose very name was a declaration of war, Charles the Hammer, Charles Martel. This wasn't just a title, it was a chilling prophecy hammered out on the anvil of battle and destined to save Western civilization. He was a force of nature, inheriting the role of mayor and turning it from a mere administrative office into the supreme military dictatorship of the entire Frankish land. The Frankish lands were fracturing, consumed by internal aristocratic squabbles, but the external threat was coalescing into a single, terrifying wave that threatened to extinguish the light of early medieval Europe entirely. Across the Pyrenees, the Umayyad Caliphate, a tidal force of faith and conquest, had swallowed Visigothic Spain whole and was now eyeing the lush, disorganized, and tempting fields of Francia. This was not a border skirmish. This was the clash of civilizations, the pivotal moment when the very survival of what would become the Western world hung by a thread thinner than fine silk. The massive Muslim force, led by Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, swept through Aquitaine like a scythe, leaving devastation and terror in its wake. They were aiming for the immense spiritual and material wealth stored within the Abbey of St. Martin in Tours. In the autumn of 732, somewhere between Tours and Poitiers, the hammer met the storm. The stakes were unimaginable. Had Charles Martel failed, the map of Europe would have been redrawn forever. The fledgling light of Christianity potentially extinguished in the West, replaced by a new, glorious, but utterly foreign caliphate stretching to the Rhine. It was a brutal, staggering confrontation, a legendary week of skirmishes culminating in a single day of crushing battle. The Frankish infantry, disciplined and desperate, formed a legendary shield wall, an unmoving, terrifying human glacier against the ceaseless charge of the light Saracen cavalry. Martel himself was everywhere, a colossal figure inspiring his men to impossible feats of courage. The sheer weight and determination of the Frankish line broke the Umayyad assault. Abd al-Rahman was killed, and the invading army, leaderless and shocked, retreated into the night. Charles Martel had not just won a battle, he had defined the boundaries of the future, earning the right to rule, not through inherited Merovingian blood, but through the glorious, chilling power of absolute battlefield victory. He died in 741, having never once worn the sacred crown of the Franks, yet having possessed every ounce of its absolute authority. He left his sons a kingdom stabilized by military might and a family legacy of competence that made the continuation of the Merovingian charade impossible. The stage was now perfectly set for the next, even more audacious step in the Carolingian ascent. Pepin executed the greatest political masterstroke of the age, a move that would permanently bind the destiny of the Frankish crown to the authority of the Church. He appealed not to the Frankish nobles, whose loyalty was volatile, but directly to the highest spiritual authority in the West, the Pope in Rome. Pope Zacharias was under intense pressure from the terrifying Lombards in Italy and desperately needed a powerful, distant military protector. Pepin posed the ultimate, devastating question to the papacy. Is it right that a king who has no power should rule, or that a man who holds all the power should be king? The answer echoed across the centuries and destroyed the Merovingian line forever. The Pope declared that the man who held the potestas, effective power, should also hold the auctoritas, sacred authority. With this divine endorsement, in 751 AD, in a scene carefully orchestrated and dripping with manufactured drama, the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was publicly stripped of his symbolic long hair, the ultimate act of ritual humiliation and desecration, and banished to a remote monastery, his entire dynasty annihilated with a snip of the scissors. Pepin was then solemnly consecrated by Saint Boniface, anointed with holy oil. This act was monumental. It was far more than a simple coronation. It was the birth of the concept of divine right in the Western tradition. Pepin was no longer just a strongman elevated by his military. He was God's chosen ruler, establishing the Carolingian dynasty not on sheer conquest alone, but on immutable religious decree. The mayor had become the king, and a new sacred covenant had been established between the Franks and the Church. Pepin the Short died in 768, leaving behind a vast, sprawling kingdom secured by the solemn sanction of the Church, stabilized by the relentless military sword, and now ready for exponential expansion. He followed tradition and divided the realm between his two surviving sons, Carloman and Charles. The tension was immediate, palpable, and inevitable. Two brothers, two kings, sharing a throne meant only for one. This unstable arrangement was the explosive powder keg that the next, most crucial chapter of history required. Carloman was known to be pious, reserved, and sickly. Charles, however, was anything but. He was physically enormous, aggressively charismatic, politically ruthless, and possessed of a hyperactive, terrifying intellect that demanded movement and expansion. For 3 years, the Frankish kingdom held its collective breath, waiting for the inevitable fraternal war to erupt and tear the new dynasty apart. Then, in the dark winter of 771, the hand of fate intervened with brutal and convenient efficiency. Carloman died suddenly, conveniently, and without any remaining male heirs who could challenge the immediate succession. The stage was now cleared of all obstruction. The final, terrifying element had been put into place. Charles stood alone, the sole, uncontested king of the Franks. The useless power of the do-nothing kings was dead. The military power of the hammer had been formalized, and the political power of the church had sanctified the entire inheritance. The man who would inherit this impossible, sprawling domain was now ready to move, to conquer, and to begin the work of building the empire that would change the world forever. The world held its breath, waiting for the inevitable crack, the moment the weight of the collapsed Roman Empire would crush this young, arrogant king known only as Clovis. He was a Ragnus among wolves, a leader of the Salian Franks, inheriting a tiny kingdom centered around Tournai, a blip on the map of absolute anarchy. But the great secret of Clovis was not his existing strength. It was his chilling ambition, a hunger that devoured maps and treaties. He looked across the ruined landscape of Gaul, seeing not chaos, but untapped real estate ripe for the taking, provided he could deal with the last ghost of Rome that still haunted the land. This ghost had a name, and it ruled from the mighty, decaying walls of Soissons, controlling the final, stubborn remnant of classical authority in Western Europe. Syagrius, the self-proclaimed king of the Romans, was the final flicker of ancient power, a warlord holding on to the domain of Soissons like a death grip. He commanded the last standing Roman legions, man who still wore the faded purple and screamed the Latin war cries, tragically believing the legions could truly march and conquer again. For decades, this Roman island had stood impervious to the Germanic tides, a defiant monument to a time when civilization meant aqueducts and law, not mud huts and blood feuds. Clovis understood that as long as Syagrius breathed, the Franks would remain just barbarians, splintered and subordinate to the memory of a greater past. The clash was inevitable, a reckoning between the old order clinging desperately to life and the brutal new force determined to bury it forever beneath a mountain of Frankish steel and ambition. In the year 486 AD, the two forces met near Soissons, a confrontation that history would record not just as a battle, but as the official, irreversible death certificate of Western Roman rule in Gaul. It wasn't just a military engagement, it was an execution of an entire era delivered by the savage hand of the rising Frankish warlord. Clovis, leading his combined Frankish hordes, fast, vicious, and utterly merciless, met the disciplined but deeply demoralized Roman lines. Syagrius's legions, trained for parade and textbook maneuvers, were unprepared for the savage, personal warfare of the Franks, who fought with a wild, desperate energy forged in the lawless forest. The struggle was short, sharp, and horrific. Syagrius fled south in frantic panic, seeking refuge with the Visigoths, the Arian heretics who controlled vast swaths of Spain and southern Gaul. But Clovis was relentless. He demanded the refugee be handed over, making it terrifyingly clear that refusal meant immediate, existential war with the burgeoning Frankish power. The victory brought not just land and strategic position, but unimaginable spoils. Vast treasures, Roman gold, and priceless artifacts suddenly flooded the hands of the victorious Franks, fueling the greed and ambition of every warrior. Among the loot was the legendary vase of Soissons, a sacred object of immense spiritual and material value stolen from a Catholic church. According to this brutal code, the spoils of war had to be divided absolutely equally by lot, and the king was owed nothing more than any other warrior. One massive Frankish warrior, driven by defiance or sheer uncontrollable greed, strode forward as Clovis reached for the sacred vase, raising his battle axe and smashing the precious artifact into fragments. The man's declaration was chilling, a direct challenge to the throne. "You shall receive nothing here but what the lot fairly assigns to you." The room froze. This was an open, lethal act of insubordination against the rising king. Clovis, however, swallowed his fury, hiding the insult deep within his memory, knowing that the time was not yet ripe for the vengeance he craved. A year passed, a period of simmering, unbearable tension. The opportunity for retribution arrived during a seemingly routine military review. Clovis examined the troops, spotting the insolent warrior among the ranks, and found fault with the state of the man's weapon, a flimsy, transparent excuse for murder. With the military challenge subdued, Clovis turned his gaze to the greatest strategic threat that still loomed: spiritual isolation. The Franks were pagans, worshipping the dark gods of war and forest spirits, surrounded by a deeply hostile Christian world that despised their barbarian customs. The powerful Visigoths, the Burgundians, and the Ostrogoths were all Arian Christians, viewed as dangerous heretics by the native Gallo-Roman population and the powerful bishops who still controlled the cities. Clovis realized the geopolitical calculus was painfully simple and unavoidable. If he remained pagan, he would always be an outsider, unable to command the loyalty of the sophisticated Roman elite. If he became Arian, he would align with his current rivals. But if he embraced Catholicism, the Nicene Creed championed by Rome, he would instantly gain the unconditional loyalty of the bishops, the unwavering support of the remaining educated class, and a moral, divine justification for conquering every surrounding Arian kingdom. Enter Clotilde, the formidable Burgundian princess who was Clovis's wife. A fervent Catholic, she relentlessly pressured her husband, using every familial tragedy and political opportunity to push him toward conversion and the true faith. The moment of destiny finally arrived during a savage, desperate war with the Alemanni, a fierce Germanic confederation pressing relentlessly from the east. The Franks were losing, their lines buckling under the relentless assault, facing total annihilation. In a scene of utter battlefield despair, Clovis, the pagan warrior who scorned the Christian God, knelt in the mud and screamed his desperate, irreversible prayer into the earth-shaking roar of the conflict. "God of Clotilde, if you grant me victory over these enemies, I will believe in you and I will be baptized." The tide, history records, turned immediately. The Alemanni broke, their king was slain, and the Franks swept the field in a shocking, divine reversal of fate. Clovis had made a promise, a pact with destiny, and now he had to pay the ultimate price to cement his power. The year was 496 AD. On Christmas Day, Clovis, along with 3,000 of his fiercest warriors, marched toward the baptistry in Reims, led by the formidable Bishop Remigius. This was not merely a spiritual event. It was the explosive, sacred birth of the French nation. As Clovis stepped into the water, Remigius famously declared the words that would define the next 1,000 years of European history. Bow your head, proud Secember. Burn what you have adored, and adore what you have burned. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifyingly effective. Clovis was now not just a barbarian king, he was the legitimate defender of the true faith, the only Catholic Germanic ruler in Western Europe. He had successfully merged Frankish steel with Roman ecclesiastical legitimacy, becoming the anointed champion of the entire continent. This strategic stroke of genius meant the vast Gallo-Roman population, the wealthy landowners, and the institutional church itself would now see the Franks as their protectors, their destiny, their singular hope in the Dark Ages. The foundations of the most powerful, enduring kingdom of the Middle Ages had just been poured in the sacred, life-giving waters of Reims, setting the stage for the final, bloody purging of the heretics and the forging of the eternal kingdom of Francia. Clovis emerged from the baptismal font in Reims, not merely cleansed of sin, but weaponized by divine authority. The holy water didn't just wash away his pagan past, it consecrated his ambition, transforming the tribal chief into the Holy Trinity's personal generalissimo on earth, and the results were immediate, absolute, and violently apocalyptic for every non-Catholic entity in Gaul. He had traded the fickle, storm-tossed patronage of Odin for the ironclad, centralized mandate of the Roman god, a strategic pivot that instantly granted him the moral high ground and the loyalty of the sophisticated Gallo-Roman populace, who were desperate for a return to stability and the true faith. Suddenly, the lingering power of the mighty Visigoths, who still held the vast sun-drenched territories of Aquitaine and Septimania, was not just a strategic problem, but a theological emergency that demanded immediate, bloody resolution. Clovis, now the self-proclaimed defender of the faith, could no longer tolerate the Arian heresy breathing down the neck of his nascent Catholic kingdom, especially since the local populations viewed the Visigoths as occupying heretics and secretly prayed for the arrival of the Frankish liberator. This was no mere war of conquest. This was a glorious, righteous crusade, sanctioned by Bishop Remigius himself, aiming to purge Gaul of its spiritual pollutants and unite the entire land under the absolute banner of the single, true Catholic God. The Frankish war machine roared south like an unstoppable judgment. In 507 AD, near the fields of Vouillé, the entire fate of Western Europe hung suspended on the razor-sharp tips of Frankish lances. King Alaric II of the Visigoths, confident in his Roman inheritance, his sophisticated governance, and his skilled Gothic cavalry, faced a Frankish host fueled by a terrifying, burning religious zealotry, marching under a banner that promised eternal salvation for every drop of blood spilled against the heretic foe. Imagine the deafening scene. The clash of mail, the terrifying, guttural Frankish battle cry echoing across the plain, the sky choked with the dust of colliding empires, and the overwhelming sensation that God himself was marching with the Franks. Clovis, always the frontline warrior, refused to delegate the climax of this holy mission. He personally tracked down and slew Alaric II in single combat. A move so audacious and strategically devastating, it instantly shattered the Visigothic line and ensured a total, crushing victory for the Catholic cause. The immense treasure hoards of Toulouse, the Visigothic capital, were instantly seized and funneled into the Frankish treasury, pouring unimaginable wealth into the Merovingian coffers, and suddenly, almost overnight, the Frankish kingdom stretched territorially from the Rhine River all the way down to the mighty Pyrenees, claiming everything in Gaul except the narrow, difficult coastal strip of Septimania. Gaul was utterly gone. The old, fractured Roman political geography was violently erased, replaced by the sprawling, aggressive, and unified entity now recognized universally as Francia. But how do you govern a territory this immense, populated by disparate Germanic tribes and the highly sophisticated, yet defeated, Gallo-Roman elites? Clovis was a political genius. He understood that to truly rule, he needed more than just the sharp edge of a sword. He needed legitimacy, bureaucracy, and crucially, he needed codified law. This is where the infamous, history-shaping Salic law comes into play. The written code of the Salian Franks, meticulously compiled and formalized under Clovis's watchful, calculating eye. It codified everything from staggering fines for theft to the standardized compensation required for murder, establishing a complex, brutal, yet universally standardized legal framework across the entire, massive melting pot of his newly forged empire. However, one seemingly minor clause embedded deep within that revolutionary law would eventually tear his kingdom apart, causing centuries of carnage and defining the course of French history. The clause that explicitly and inflexibly excluded women from inheriting the terra salica, the core family land, and, crucially, by extension, the crown itself. Clovis, having unified the Franks and conquered the enemies of God, then made the classic, fatal Germanic mistake, ensuring centuries of instability. Following his death in 511 AD, he divided the entire realm, which he had fought his whole life to unite, among his 4 surviving sons, Thierry, Clodomir, Childebert, and Clothar. The very empire forged in the fire of holy war and administrative genius was instantly fractured into 4 competing, fiercely ambitious, and mutually suspicious kingdoms: Austrasia the east, Neustria the west, Burgundy eventually, and Paris the core, setting the stage for 200 years of relentless, horrifying fratricidal carnage and relentless civil war among the Merovingian bloodline. These were not minor border skirmishes fought over grazing rights. This was institutionalized, dynastic warfare fought with unimaginable cruelty, where survival hinged on immediate preemptive violence. Brothers plotted the murder of nephews. Queens, like the monstrously infamous Fredegund and the equally ruthless Brunhilde, became masters of poison, assassination, and political intrigue, turning the royal courts into viper pits of murderous, unending ambition. The unity Clovis fought so hard for dissolved almost immediately into a permanent state of brutal, medieval partition, where the only constant was the ever-present threat of a knife in the back, ensuring that the saga of Francia would not be one of eventual peace, but an endless, exhilarating cycle of bloody retribution. The Merovingians, often called the long-haired kings due to their symbolic, uncut hair, believed to be the source of their mystical power, were increasingly defined by their debauchery, their profound instability, and their utter lack of centralized governance. They ruled from horseback, often drunk or sickly, traveling between their scattered villas, leaving the actual, tiresome work of state administration to powerful, rising figures known deceptively as the mayors of the palace. These kings, the descendants of the great Clovis, were often little more than glorious, long-haired figureheads, their power diluted by internal feuds, and their focus fixed solely on eliminating the nearest royal relative standing between them and a slightly larger blood-soaked share of the fragmented patrimony. Brunhilde, though initially more Romanized and perhaps civilized, responded to Fredegon's calculated brutality with her own equally ruthless ambition, plunging the kingdoms into such consistent terror and administrative chaos that the church itself struggled desperately to contain the carnage. The stage was set for the eventual, inevitable decline of the entire dynasty, rotting from within, awaiting the strong, decisive hand that would eventually seize the reins of power from these perpetually squabbling, long-haired psychopaths. The age of the mayor of the palace was dawning, but first, the Merovingian brothers had to finish tearing each other apart, ensuring that the dark, bloody legacy of Clovis's fatal division would echo through the entire history of France for 1,000 years. They had inherited the greatest prize in Europe and systematically, savagely, dismantled it piece by agonizing piece, believing that the only path to glory was through the murder of their own kin. The endless cycle of betrayal, forced monasticism, and sudden, brutal assassination left the royal line spiritually, physically, and politically bankrupt. This was not just a political crisis. It was a divine curse hanging heavy over the Frankish soul, demanding payment in the currency of darkness and ceaseless, miserable conflict. The people, battered by endless civil strife and crushing local taxes levied by greedy warring counts, began to yearn for any semblance of order, regardless of who provided it. The true tragedy of the Merovingians was that they ran out of competent psychopaths long before they ran out of gold or land. Their genetic pool, diluted by generations of inbreeding and fratricidal stress, produced kings who were increasingly weak-willed, easily manipulated, or simply too young to rule the vast, volatile domains their great-grandfathers had conquered. As the kings grew weaker, stupider, or simply younger and more easily manipulated, a terrible shadow began to fall across the throne. It was a shadow cast not by a rival king, but by a servant, the ultimate administrative fixer, the man who handled the bloody details, the Major Domus, the mayor of the palace. This was the most terrifying political coup in history, precisely because it was so quiet, so perfectly mundane. Imagine the most powerful corporate CEO running the entire company, making all strategic decisions, while the actual shareholder, the king, is just a pretty, long-haired figurehead used for branding and signing ancient documents. That was the grim reality of the later Merovingian court. These mayors were the true masters of the army, the controllers of the vast royal treasury, the dispensers of patronage, and the judges who actually executed the laws of the land. The king was merely the man who had to sit still long enough for the ritual haircut that proved his noble yet utterly useless lineage. The political landscape now shifted from a competition between crowns to a deadly, high-stakes rivalry between these powerful administrators. The man who could control the king controlled the kingdom, and the man who controlled the most land could appoint the best mayor. The first man bold enough to truly try and seize the crown openly was Grimoald the Elder, a towering figure from the powerful lineage that would eventually become the Carolingians. He was the mayor of the Palace of Austrasia, the gritty, tough Eastern Frankish kingdom where real power was forged in military steel. He then crowned his own son, Childebert the Adopted, king of Austrasia. This was an electrical shock to the entire political and spiritual system. He had dared to break the sacred spell of the long-haired kings, and for a terrifying moment it seemed he would succeed. The lesson was learned, etched in blood. You could rule the king, you could own the king, but you dared not become the king. Not yet. Yet the seeds of the new dynasty had been planted in the rich, dark soil of Austrasian aristocracy, and the power that defined them, the power of the Pippinids, was growing exponentially, silently, in the background. The stage was now set for a dynasty-defining battle for ultimate control of the mayoralty itself, primarily between the houses of Neustria, the wealthy west, and Austrasia, the militaristic east, plunging the already fractured realm into new depths of civil war. Enter Pippin II of Herstal, a man whose ambition was as vast as the lands he intended to control. He was the grandson of the powerful Bishop Arnulf of Metz, and an heir to the methodical, political machine that Grimewald had built, learning from his ancestors' fatal mistake. Pippin was not content with merely running Austrasia. He wanted all the palaces. The ultimate showdown arrived in 687 AD at the Battle of Tertry. A clash so decisive it would literally rewrite the foundation of French history for 1,000 years. Pippin's tough, disciplined Austrasian forces faced the Neustrian army led by their mayor Burchar in a desperate struggle for the soul of the Frankish kingdom. The result was a catastrophe for Neustria, a complete and total military annihilation. Pippin II crushed his rival completely, establishing himself as the undisputed de facto ruler of all the Frankish realms, from the Rhine to the Loire. He took the powerful title Duke and Prince of the Franks. This was it. The Merovingian king still sat on the throne, his long hair flowing beautifully, his robes rich with purple dye, but his crown was now a ceremonial prop, a mere costume piece in a dramatic play directed entirely by Pippin. The power had officially moved out of the royal chambers and into the mayor's office. And this brings us to the ultimate, tragicomic insult against the concept of monarchy, the era of the roi fainéants, the do-nothing kings. This phrase perfectly captures the humiliating, slow decline of the once mighty line of Clovis, who had once held the world in his grasp. These kings were political zombies, wheeled out once a year in an ox cart. Yes, an ox cart, a symbol of their complete lack of military mobility or administrative power, to preside over the Marchfield Assembly. They were forced to read speeches written entirely by the mayor of the palace, often barely understanding the words they spoke. Their only true royal duty was to exist, to sit upon the throne and confirm the divine right of the mayors to rule in their names. They were prisoners in their own magnificent halls, often dying young from boredom, depression, or a well-placed political illness administered by the very men who served them. They were kings of spectacular, tragic hair, and nothing else. They had traded power for mere pageantry and competence for purely ceremonial duties, completely surrendering the hard-won authority of their savage ancestors. Pippin II, having secured total, unchallenged control, was the quiet, methodical architect of the Carolingian future. He ruled until 714 AD, ensuring that the infrastructure of power was firmly anchored outside the Merovingian family, forging unbreakable bonds with the Frankish nobility and securing vast tracts of land for his own house. When he died, the succession was briefly messy, throwing the kingdom into one last chaotic flare of civil war as rivals fought to control the mayoralty. But emerging from that darkness, like a thunderbolt forged in the fires of battle, was Pippin's illegitimate yet infinitely powerful son. A man forged in the fires of military necessity, possessing the cold, calculating mind of a true statesman, combined with the brutal savagery of his Frankish ancestors, Charles Martel. And he was about to face a monumental, existential threat that would either destroy the last vestiges of Christian Europe or secure his dynasty forever.